Hello, I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us today as we continue our study in the book of 1 Samuel. We're going to be in the final two chapters of 1 Samuel today. We're going to come to the end of what I think is a very tragic life, of course, the life of Saul, but it also clears the way for David to later assume the throne. You recall in previous chapters how David had been sent away by the Philistines while they head north to battle Saul. David heads south to a city called Ziklag, a city that he had been given by the Philistines and apparently one that he'd been living in for some time. But before that, in chapter 28, in an incident that seems to coincide with everything that we've been reading here, Saul knew that this battle was coming, and his dread is apparent. In fact, in 1 Samuel 28 and in verse 5, it says, when Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Now that's a big turn for a fellow who himself was a mighty warrior. Saul, at one point, wasn't afraid of anybody, and he helped the Israelites with their battles against the Philistines on several occasions. But his fate in 1 Samuel chapter 28 has been reaffirmed to him. It had been foretold before, but in chapter 28, remember, he had gone to a medium and had called up the spirit of Saul, or rather Samuel, and Samuel told him, tomorrow by this time you'll be with me. He knows it's coming, and he's afraid of what's about to happen. But David, on his part, as I said, heads down south to Ziklag, probably relieved that he doesn't have to go into battle against his king. And when he gets to Ziklag, he's going to have to deal with a personal crisis, and then later on, of course, it's going to be a national crisis. But for now, David is going to have to do something about the situation that he finds himself in when he gets to Ziklag. Let's read the first several verses of 1 Samuel chapter 30. In 1 Samuel 30, beginning in verse 1, it says, then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed, because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Well, by this time, Saul had reigned for about 40 years, and David had been a fugitive running from him for anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So David's had a lot to contend with in all this time. There's been a lot that's been going over the years, much more than certainly Scripture tells us about. But what it does tell us about is heartbreaking in a lot of ways. In fact, we see David's sorrow here as he considers the destruction of the Amalekites. They not only raided Ziklag, the city, in their absence, but it wasn't enough for them just to take supplies and leave. What they did was they burned the city, completely destroyed it, and not only that, but took their families as well. The Amalekites are depicted as ruthless terrorists who take vicious advantage of weaker opponents. And that's how we find them when we're first introduced to them back in the book of Exodus. I'm going to go back to Exodus chapter 17 for a minute. Exodus chapter 17. As the Israelites were beginning to make their way through the wilderness, they hadn't been but newly freed from Egypt. And one of the first troubles that they come across is an Amalekite raid. The Amalekites, who think they can just take advantage of a weakened opponent. It says in Exodus 17 verse 8, then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. And we're told about how God had mightily rescued the Israelites from Amalek, but there's a warning here that there's going to be trouble with them for a long time. But God is going to do something about it. In verse 14, it says, the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And we've seen in certain places where there were these skirmishes with the Amalekites. We see it in the book of Judges when the tribe of Simeon fights against the Amalekites. But I wonder, would this have ever happened? Probably not. The incident that we're seeing here in 1 Samuel 30 probably never would have happened if Saul would have just done his job as God told him to do in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Would have certainly saved David and his men a lot of distress at the loss they'd suffered. We can only imagine the horror of David and his men as they come back to their city and discover not only the smoking ruins of their city, but also the absence of their families. And we see here that their sorrow, the sorrow of David's men, quickly turns to anger. Verse 4 says that they wept until there were no more tears to cry. But then verse 6 says that the people spoke of stoning David. And that's what happens. If for no other reason, then the people sometimes need somebody to blame. And for David, since he was the leader, the buck stopped with him. So what did David do? I mean, think about it. He comes home, his own home is destroyed, his own family is gone, and now the people are impugning his leadership, getting ready to kill him. What does he do? Well, David steps up, and he acts like a leader. And not surprisingly, David, it tells us in verse 6, found his strength in the Lord his God. And perhaps one of the reasons why David was able to find his strength is because he knew that he could communicate with God. And that's what we'll read about next as we talk about David's success. Let's talk about first how David seeks direction from God through authorized means. In verse 7 it says, then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will certainly or surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor remained behind. Ironically, it seems chronologically that while David is seeking help or advice from God, at the same time Saul is seeking advice from a medium. But David makes an inquiry, a lot like he does in earlier chapters when he sought God's advice concerning Keilah and whether or not the people of Keilah would turn him over to Saul. He asks some very specific questions, and God gives him very specific answers. And so, having been assured that, having received the answers from God and knowing that it was direction from him, David takes off in hot pursuit. But he's got to leave behind 200 men who were just too exhausted to go on. He leaves them at a brook called Besor, and he continues on with 400 men. And he gets to a place where he's able to get some valuable information from an Egyptian. As we keep reading, it says in verse 11 that they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. They gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. Then his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite. And my master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. We made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites, and on that day, or rather and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." David said to him, "Will you bring me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band." Now we'll stop there for a minute. We see that this Egyptian man was abandoned because he fell asleep, or rather fell sick. But it highlights the unfeeling ruthlessness that we already get an idea of the Amalekites. They are ruthless people. And it contrasts with the kind treatment that he gets from David's men. They feed him, they give him something to drink, they allow him to rest up. Don't forget, this is a guy who was involved in the raid that had burned their city and kidnapped their people. And yet, they're kind to him, and the kindness is returned. He gives them information about about their whereabouts, with the condition that he not be delivered into the hands of his master, because he knows what's going to happen. He's going to be considered a traitor and more than likely killed. But he offers to take David and his men there himself. Makes you think, well, maybe he wants revenge on those who had abandoned him before. But here's an opportunity, I think, for us to see something important about God's providence. When David asked for God's help, when he asked for God's instruction, God told David that he would succeed, that he would surely overtake them. But David had his own work to do. And I think the capturing and the interrogation of this Egyptian was part of that work. David could have just said, "Oh, well, God's going to take care of it, so I don't have to worry about it." No, David had to take off in hot pursuit. David had to get whatever information he could about the whereabouts of the Amalekites, and he got that from a man who had been left abandoned by them. It's a reminder to us that though God makes good and gracious promises to us, there are usually conditions that we have to take upon ourselves in order to fulfill. I'm thinking about what Jesus said in Mark 16 and verse 16, where he said that he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Now, the will be saved part is the promise. And that's usually the promise that everybody just latches onto because we want that. We want salvation. But Jesus says it's for those who obey the condition. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. There's a condition in order to obey the promise, or rather in order to apprehend the promise. There are conditions to be obeyed in order for the promises to be received. And I think we can see that implied here in the situation here with David. And so David did what Saul ought to have done. Let's continue reading in verse 16. When he had brought him down, behold, they were spread all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. David slaughtered them from the twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and rescued his 2 wives. But nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken from themselves. David brought it all back. So David had captured all the sheep and the cattle which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, "This is David's spoil." So as I said before, David did what Saul ought to have done. He decimated the Amalekites. And it's interesting, how big a group must they have been if 400 of them got away on camels and fled, as verse 17 tells us. The bigger point here is that God used David to fulfill that ancient prophecy. You remember the one that we had read from Exodus chapter 17 and verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Well, that's exactly what happens here. So complete was David's destruction of the Amalekites that they are never mentioned again in the Old Testament history books. David's resounding success is highlighted not just by the defeat of the Amalekites, but by the recovery of not only all the stuff, but also their families. It says at the end of verse 19, David brought it all back. And of course, they're grateful. It says in verse 20 that they said, this is because of David. This is David's spoil. Now they're all going to have a share in it, as we're going to see in a moment. But where before they were about to stone him and kill him, now they're saying, this is because of David. Of course, David would say, no, it's because of God. Well, let's talk about the sharing that we see occurring in verses 21 through 31. It says, when David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, who had also been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him, then David approached the people and greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men among those who went with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Now we'll stop there for just a minute. It's easy to see the resentment of these men who had gone off and done the hard work of running down the enemy, of doing all the surveillance, and then finally the hard work of fighting and recovering their families and their stuff. But David is about to lay down a principle that's going to be a principle from then on in Israel. Let's continue reading. In verse 23, it says, then David said, you must not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us, who has kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us. And who will listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. So it has been from that day forward that he made it a statute and ordinance for Israel to this day. David makes two important points here. One, he says, it's God's spoils. God is the one who gave the spoils. I didn't do it. Don't forget who we got this from. This is a gracious gift from God. And secondly, everyone shares equally. All are equal sharers. He says in verse 24, for as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And it says from that day forward, it was a statute and an ordinance for Israel. They recognized the graciousness of the concept, and so they adopted it. And David continues to be gracious and generous. Look at verse 26. It says, now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, behold, a gift for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. To those who were in Bethel, and to those who were in Ramoth of the Negev, and to those who were in Jatir, and to those who were in Aroer, and to those who were at Siphmoth, and to those who were in Eshtemoa, and to those who were in Rakal, and to those who were in the cities of the Jeremielites, and to those who were in the cities of the Kenites, and to those who were in Hormon, to those who were in Borashan, and to those who were in Athak, to those who were in Hebron, to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to go. So all these places where David and his men had moved around for those years that they were in hiding or in a fugitive state from Saul, David went among his countrymen, and he remembered them. In fact, what the gifts that David is doing now among the people of Judah is going to help him later on to consolidate his rule. So David understands how important it is to show kindness to his people. After all, they're going to be the people that he's going to be ruling very shortly. And so think about when David had returned at the beginning of this chapter to Ziklag. Everything seemed dark, lost. David had not only lost his home, but his family. And his followers, his men, were on the verge of stoning him. But by his faith and his follow-through, David found the resolve to turn it around. Of course, there are a lot of important lessons for us there. Believe in God, do what he says, and things will be better. We can see here also, though, a lot of contrasts between Saul and David. We've seen Saul's humiliation. On the other side of that scale, we've seen David's successes. We've seen Saul's desperation as he seeks advice from a medium, an outlawed person, while David seeks God continually and gets answers from God. We've seen examples of Saul's selfishness, and here we've seen David's generosity. We see how Saul sinks deeper and deeper and deeper into insecurity and paranoia, while David's confidence, based on his relationship with God, continues to grow. Saul is seen as a self-absorbed, inconsistent, and unpredictable despot, while David is passionate about defending God's honor and the welfare of his men and his family. David loves his God, he loves his people, and it shows. And it makes a lot of difference for him. As we come to the end of 1 Samuel, chapter 31 gives us a short finality to this whole ordeal of Saul's life. Saul's defeat in chapter 31 is also recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, 1 through 14. But we see very quickly how Saul loses everything in a very short manner of time. For instance, Saul loses his army. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, it says, "Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa." At this time, David is enjoying the reunification, or at least the unity of his men who at one point were about to kill him, and the reunion of his family, while Saul and his men are experiencing the horror of fighting an army that is very well prepared to enact their defeat. And Saul is witnessing the loss of his once formidable army. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 16, God says that Saul is going to be his instrument, his tool to work against the Philistines. It's ironic, I think, that eventually Saul dies at the hands of that enemy, that God was to use him as one that would stand against them. Of course, we see where Saul not only lost his army, Saul lost his life. Let's continue reading in 1 Samuel chapter 31. Verse 2 says, "The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me.' But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together." You remember Samuel's haunting words back in chapter 28. In chapter 28 and verse 19, Samuel told Saul, "The Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. It had been reaffirmed, and now it had come to pass. Saul knew that his time had come, and of course God had reassured him of it. Rejected, think about just before Saul died. Dejected, his son's already dead, the enemy advancing, utterly emptied of hope. Saul chooses suicide instead of falling into the hands of the enemy. His fear is that they'll make sport of him. They'll pierce me through and make sport of me, he says. Remember that maybe not too long earlier, they had done that with Samson. They had made sport of Samson, humiliated him in the temple of their God. Who knows what indignities they might have subjected Saul to. And even though Saul implores his armor bearer to kill him, the armor bearer won't do it. Says he was greatly afraid to do so. Maybe he's afraid of divine retribution. I don't know, it doesn't tell us. We know that that's one of the reasons why David would never do any harm to Saul, because he kept calling him Yahweh's anointed, the Lord's anointed. This is God's choice. I'm not going to do any harm to him. Maybe some of that is present in the armor bearer's refusal to do anything against Saul. Now, for whatever reason, he doesn't do it. Saul kills himself, and the armor bearer knows it's hopeless himself, and he kills himself. It's a sad end, but it's not all that Saul had lost. He lost his army, he lost his life, but Saul also lost his honor. In verse 7 of 1 Samuel 31, says, when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the cities came and lived in them, or rather than the Philistines came and lived in them. And it came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, stripped off his weapons, and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. And they put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh, and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. Remember, Saul's fear is that he's going to be abused at the hands of the Philistines, and actually he is. If only in death. They behead him, they hang his body on a wall of a once Israelite city. They're in Israel's territory, but apparently it's a city that had been overtaken and had fallen into Philistine occupation. And Saul and his sons are gruesomely depicted on the wall of that city as trophies for all to see. And they take their belongings and their weapons and they send them throughout their land as articles of boasting about what they had done. And no doubt this spectacle was intended to be a show of their power, and maybe an indication of their hopes to go even further and conquer Israel. I mean, after all, this isn't just any battle that they won. They killed the king. And not only that, but they killed the sons of the king. No doubt they're thinking that total victory for them against Israel isn't very far off. However, it does tell us that even in death and amid this humiliation that Saul is going through, there were some who remembered him. These valiant men, it tells us, from Jabesh-Gilead on the eastern side of the Jordan, bravely enter Philistine occupied territory and retrieve the bodies of Saul and his sons. Several chapters ago, back in 1 Samuel chapter 11, we read about how soon after he became king, Saul had helped the Jabesh-Gileadites fend off an Ammonite invasion. They wanted to take over the city of Jabesh-Gilead, and Saul helped them to fend off that attack. He saved their city, and they never forgot it. Their dangerous journey across the river into enemy territory gave them opportunity to pay one final tribute to a man who saved their city, but seems to have done little else for God's people. And through their kindness and regard for Saul, they give him a decent burial. But there's still some further loss of honor here. Saul wasn't buried in his family's territory, the land of Benjamin. Now he will later, but at this point he's not. But though he's shown this kindness by the men from Jabesh Gilead, it doesn't erase the reason why Saul fell in the first place. 1 Chronicles 10, verses 13 and 14 says this: So Saul died for his trespass which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him, and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. David will later pen a beautiful lament for the fall of his king Saul and his best friend Jonathan in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And then much later, he'll take the bones of those men and bury them in the territory of Benjamin in 2 Samuel chapter 21. But for now, thus ends one of the most tragic lives in ancient Israel. In 1 Samuel, we have read the story of three men, Samuel, Saul, and David. But it's really the story of one God, the one God who used these three men for his own divine purpose. And of course, it's just the beginning. In 2 Samuel, we'll see the rise of David. And we'll continue to see David not only with all his pluses, but with his minuses as well. And sometimes maybe we'll relate to David as he fails from time to time, but always finds a way to come back and to hope and trust in God. Well, thanks for joining us as we have gone through the book of 1 Samuel. And we hope we'll see you again. God bless you.